program. The Water Watchdog program is something that's been around at Clark Fork Coalition since our genesis. You know, our organization really started as an advocacy organization, and the Watchdog program is just our tool to equip you guys with the knowledge, the tools, the support you need to actively participate in some of these policies, some of these regulatory discussions. During the biennial legislative sessions, we pull our water watchdogs in a lot, and we're asking you and giving you updates that are tracking bills, that are talking about what these bills mean in terms of water quality. We're preparing you and asking you to testify in the legislative session in front of those bill hearings and give your perspective as a watershed resident. And then also asking you to spread the good word in your networks, right? And pull people into the fold. But in between sessions, we know that advocacy doesn't stop. And in between sessions in a year like 2026, we're asking for your help monitoring developments in the watershed. We'll share what we are really tuned into tracking tonight. We're giving calls to action to engage in public comment sessions, sharing petitions, giving notice of public meetings. There are opportunities in between the legislative sessions to connect directly with those people who represent you in those decisions, to connect with decision makers at the Forest Service, those public places. And always looking to you guys to be our bullhorns and our cowbells out in the community, reminding people with everything that's going on. River protection is really a place where we know our advocacy can move the needle. We have seen in our lifespan at Clark Fork Coalition the impact that the community's advocacy and watchdogging has. We've had huge successes. Community watchdogging is one of the reasons we have a complete ecological restoration at the site of the Milltown Dam at the Blackfoot and Clark Fork confluence, instead of a solution that maybe was waste in place and an alternate water source. Your voice, the voices of the community, are one of the primary ways we prevented a massive gold mine from going into the Blackfoot headwaters in the 1970s. Community voice in that point actually led to legislation that said no cyanide heap leach mining in our state. In the last legislative session, your voices really helped us accomplish something that's really near and dear and a key strategy for Clark Fork Coalition, which is combating dewatering, making sure there's enough water in our streams. And we sent out a handful of bills to you guys weighed in, and we ended up with the tools, some new tools that we're really excited about for combating chronic dewatering and addressing water supply in stream. But again, we know that this is not one and done. We need to stay consistent and stay engaged. And so again, thank you for coming out tonight to hear about where the Clark Fork Coalition is, to hear about where some of these key focuses for us are, and also to share your thoughts and your questions and ideas with Clark Fork Coalition at the end. We're gonna dive into some ongoing policy challenges that we have. We're gonna start with exempt wells. And Andrew Gorder, go ahead and raise your hand, Andrew. Give a little wave. Andrew Gorder is Clark Fork Coalition's policy director, and he is our main tie-in to those legislative sessions, and also he's our main tie-in to any decisions that go into litigation or what's the next step when we see that policy come out. We're going to be talking about nutrient standards and a major shift that happened during the last legislative session. Sam Carlson is our science director and has been heavily involved in that. He's going to give you that update. And then the last one that we're really going to focus on tonight that I guess isn't up here is the fact that we have legacy contamination tied up in federal policy and federal regulation, and that push is ongoing and slow and sometimes onerous. Tonight we're really going to focus in on Smurfit down in Frenchtown and what's happening with that. So without any more things from me, I'm going to turn, oops, I switched the order. We're going to turn it over and check in on nutrient pollution.
Thanks, Lily. Thanks everyone for coming. I I'd like to echo what Lily said. We certainly hope that we can share some information, some of what we've picked up in the work that we do, but we want to learn from you guys as well. We want to understand you concerned how the community engages with these issues. That really helps us to be as effective as we can. So for anyone who has been involved in the Water Watchdogs program or paying attention to water policy in the state of Montana for the last decade, you've heard a lot about nutrient standards. There have been two major bills, one in the 2025 legislative session and one previously. There have been a number of lawsuits. And now in 2026, we're operating under a new set of nutrient standards that, to be honest, we don't quite understand. So I'm going to I'll just start real basic, talk about sort of the paradox of nutrient pollution, the regulatory frameworks, where we're at, and then a little bit about, what we expect going forward, how we anticipate engaging with the agencies, and the role that the community can play in this. So just to call nutrients a pollutant is a bit of a paradox, because nutrients are nutrients, right? They're fundamentally necessary for life, and we are happy that we have nutrients in our rivers. The main two, nitrogen and phosphorus, well, it turns out that we have a lot more of them than we'd like. There are innumerable sources of nitrogen, everything from fossil fuel combustion to fertilizer to like the wastewater treatment plant in Missoula or dispersed septic systems. All of those are major sources of nitrogen and phosphorus across the watershed. So what's the issue? Well, if the system's in balance, nitrogen and phosphorus fuel growth. In particular, they fuel algae and plants, and those are sort of the foundation of the ecosystem. But when it's out of balance, when we have too much nitrogen and phosphorus, fundamentally, the algae and the plants, all the green things in the river and stream ecosystems, they grow too quickly, they grow too much. They start to physically choke the system. We've seen that even in the Clark Fork in late June this year, right here. Go out in June again, this coming summer, and you'll likely see it. That algae, it can overgrow to such an extent that it starts to choke off the river. And of course, not only does it grow, but it also dies. And as it dies, it decays. That can deplete the oxygen in the system, which can be an issue for fish. And in extreme cases, we can actually see certain species of algae that form toxins, blue-green algae that form toxins, which are harmful to humans and sort of notoriously dangerous for dogs, which will drink the water not knowing any better. So because nutrients, they're such a fundamental part of the ecosystem, but they're also a fundamental part of society. We use fertilizers to add nutrients to our agriculture. Nutrients are inevitably a waste product of our cities and towns. They're a waste product of industrial processes. They also fall out of the atmosphere all across the globe because of the fossil fuels that we combust. So we have to regulate this, right? We can't just say nutrients are good. They are, although it's paradoxical, they are a pollutant and we have to regulate this. So where do I point this? Oh, it did work. All right. So there are two sort of ways we could categorize approaches to regulating nutrients. There's the numeric approach and then the narrative approach. I'm going to talk about the numeric approach first. Under a numeric approach, a body of scientists will try to form sort of a general understanding of the relationship between the amount of nutrients or the concentration of nutrients in water and then the effects that we might see. And we're really trying to hone in on like a threshold. Is there some concentration of nitrogen and phosphorus that sort of identifies or predicts when the system is going to switch from a healthy system to a degraded system? And so just to emphasize like the nonlinearity and complexity of that is often described as a dose response curve. It's definitely a curve because it's not a straight line. And that's a complex piece of science, right? But we can do it. And so a numeric approach to nutrient standards involves identifying those thresholds, essentially identifying safe levels safe concentrations of nutrients for different types of water bodies, and then empowering the regulatory system essentially to ensure that the nutrients are kept below those concentrations. So I don't want to say that's an easy approach, but it has some advantages. In contrast, the narrative approach, on its face, it seems simpler. We're no longer trying to, under a narrative framework, we're no longer trying to form, narrative just means like story, right? We're no longer trying to form a general scientific understanding of what concentration of nutrients leads to degradation of a water body. We're just observing the effects, right? We're just sort of looking at the story of the landscape. So it's this like site-specific empirical evaluation of the aquatic response. And that, under a narrative approach, that's how we would determine essentially if there's a problem and if nutrient sources need to be constrained. So I want to illustrate these again, just in the simplest possible example before we try to think about how this works across the state of Montana. So imagine that you have a very nice lawn, right? And you want it to be nice and green. And so you fertilize it, and you also have a nice little pond right there, and your lawn runs off into the pond. So under a numeric approach, you might sort of look to see who else has had a pond, right? Who else has tried to fertilize their lawn near their pond? And of course, you don't want your pond to sort of grow like overgrow algae and deplete all the oxygen and kill the fish and maybe form a toxic algae bloom. So under a numeric approach, you would look at the body of research on the subject, and you'd probably identify a concentration, a nutrient concentration that would be a good target for your pond. You know, you might say 300 micrograms per liter of nitrogen is the acceptable level, and then you can measure it. And so under that approach, you know, you'd measure, you'd say, oh, I'm getting a little bit above that in the pond, I better cut back on my fertilizer, right? Or, oh, the nutrient concentration is way below that, I guess I can fertilize a little more. Under a narrative approach for that pond, you wouldn't be relying on previous research. You would just add more fertilizer until the pond got choked with algae and started smelling bad and all the fish died. And then you'd say, okay, well, I guess I know that's too much, so I better add a little bit less. And over time, you might actually converge on the same amount of fertilizer as you would with the numeric approach. So narrative standards are possible in a simple setting like that, right? Fundamentally, they're based on this idea that if we observe a negative effect, we can try to resolve the issue. We can try to restrict the nutrient pollution. But when you think about this over the Clark Fork watershed or the whole state of Montana, it's really quite difficult. And so I want to highlight our concerns about the efficiency of narrative standards, the protectiveness of narrative standards, and just how complex they become. So efficiency, first of all, do we really have to reinvent the wheel for every nutrient source? We have done a lot of, this is not a new question, right? We have 100 years worth of work trying to understand exactly how nutrients impact water bodies. And yes, it is incredibly complex. It's fascinating. One of the scientists who's worked to develop our state-specific understandings of that is here in the room with us. And to sort of put that all aside and say, no, we're gonna form a fresh understanding of this cause and effect, this dose response curve for every source, that's just not efficient, right? Because we know so much about this. Why are we gonna put all of our knowledge aside and try to take a fresh approach at every site? And along with that comes the protectiveness challenge. If we can only regulate nutrient sources when we see harm to aquatic systems, well, that's a problem. That basically means we can't protect these systems until we see that we've injured them. And then hopefully we trust that the regulatory system can respond quickly and effectively to reduce that level of nutrient pollution. That doesn't sound easy to me. So fundamentally, it's hard to see that that narrative standards can avoid harm rather than just, at best, respond to harm. And then finally, the complexity. when we're working with numeric standards, we can think about this at a watershed scale, right? We can say, what's the concentration of nitrogen in the Clark Fork? What's the concentration of nitrogen in the Bitterroot? What's the concentration in the Blackfoot? When they come together, now what's the concentration? How much phosphorus is coming from the different source? And then, look at it, like subdivide it further as we need. How much is coming out of Flint Creek? But under a narrative framework, it's much more difficult. Say a source of pollution in the Bitterroot, doesn't matter what we pick. Basically, every human activity constitutes a source of nutrient pollution. But just imagine, like, the city of Hamilton, not to pick on the city, because all cities have these, cause this pollution. The city of Hamilton is contributing nutrients to the Bitterroot. Well, if there's no narrative interpretation, narrative observation of an effect below Hamilton, then I guess they're just fine and they can release more. But then when the Bitterroot flows into the Clark Fork, all of a sudden we have this compounding problem where we have all the nutrients from the Bitterroot and all the nutrients from the Clark Fork. And how do we allocate the responsibility? And how does the regulatory system decide who's got to spend more money and improve their water treatment plant, right? And that's just two main rivers. Then we think about, the true complexity of small streams and small rivers and big rivers and point sources of nutrients, like water treatment plants, and non-point sources like fertilizer that's used for agriculture and then gradually gets into groundwater and likely ends up into the river sooner or later. It's essentially impossible. Well, I don't know that it's impossible. It's close to impossible to understand what sources are causing an issue if we can't actually measure the amount of nutrients in the water. So if you think back to the simple example with a nice green lawn and a fish pond, yeah, effective regulation of nutrients under a narrative framework, it's not impossible. It can be done, but actually applying it over the state of Montana and applying it in a way that is efficient and also is protective, that's going to be very difficult. So the details of this very much matter. This is the second time the legislature has declared that we will move to narrative nutrient standards. So surely they're going to give us all the details we need this time, right? Well, no, there's absolutely nothing. So I quote here from Administrative Rules of Montana. I am paraphrasing, but I'm really not leaving anything relevant out. Surface waters must be free from discharges that will create conditions which produce undesirable aquatic life. That's it. That's all we have to work with. At some point, the agency charged with implementing this, the Montana Department of Environmental Quality, at some point we'd like to see from them a clearer set of procedures for interpreting this and for how they're going to apply this across the state. But this, from the Administrative Rules of Montana, this is the only baseline that we have to go off at the moment. So from conversations with GEQ and from tracking their work, they've issued one nutrient discharge permit under the narrative standards that we've been able to look through. We have picked up a couple hints of what they're going to do. Again, this is sort of like a dose response study specific to every site, which is kind of crazy. And so for their response, they're going to look at the amount of algal biomass. We think that's what we've seen them do thus far. They're going to look at the concentration of oxygen that's dissolved in the water, which is actually a pretty effective way to measure the growth and decay of algae and aquatic plants. And then they're going to measure the aquatic invertebrate communities, which are a reasonably effective indicator of sort of the overall health of the ecosystem, and in particular, whether it's suffering from some of these problems that come by being physically choked out by algae and chemically running out of oxygen at times. So that's moderately encouraging because those are good response variables. But how are they going to apply this? At what scale? Who gets to interpret undesirable aquatic life, right? Like if I don't want it, then is it violating state law? I mean, if undesirable in whose eyes? And what are the explicit standards for just, you know, how crazy the dissolved oxygen dynamics can get before we actually identify this as a problem? And again, there's this just fundamental scale mismatch where a nutrient source may be a point or it may be spread across an area, but then the response to it, the potentially harmful effects could be right there. They could be miles downstream. They could come after another tributary junction. They could come 6 months later. So it's going to be a challenge. So the opportunity for us here, there's one more thing I do want to mention, I guess, as we are the Clark Fork Coalition and we are standing right next to the Clark Fork River here. Keep gesturing that way. The river's over there. I know what I'm talking about here. The Clark Fork River is a little different. The Clark Fork River still has numeric standards. They've been in place for about 20 years. How is that can interact? How can we have numeric standards just on the main stem river, but then narrative standards on the tributaries, right? If we're observing this situation, which I would call undesirable, on the main stem of the Clark Fork, does that mean that the tributaries need to tighten up their regulation? I don't know. It's that same problem of the scale mismatch. So we continue to be dogged, I guess, since this is the Water Watchdogs program. We continue to be dogged in engaging with the Department of Environmental Quality, which again, they didn't choose to do this. They are just charged with implementing this. But we need to hear from them how they plan on implementing this at scale across the state. Then we also need to be proactive. We need to articulate to the state government and to the legislatures what we view as undesirable conditions. And we hope, you know, to join the community in doing that with a broad voice. So I think we're going to take a few minutes if anyone has any questions or discussion points on this before we move on to our next few subjects. Vicky.
I was just going to say that in the Clark Fork, where we meet the nutrient standards, we are also meeting the algae standards. And where we are not meeting the nutrient standards, we're not meeting the algae standards. And so we have shown in the Clark Fork a really good, tight relationship, that they are very predictive. And I'll also say that it was the wastewater treatment plant engineers who first asked for a numeric approach. They said, you can't come and say, we got a problem, start dialing back how much you're putting in the river. Oh, that's not enough. We still have to dial it back some more. They said, we can't do that. We can't just dial back. We got to build the plant from day one to hit a particular standard in the river. So tell us the number that we need to hit. That was the wastewater treatment engineers that asked for it for a very good reason. And that's the only way to prevent degradation, is to know how much would cause a problem and make sure you don't go there. Not wait for the problem to appear and then try to dial it back. It's much harder to do that. So thank you, wastewater engineers, for asking.
Maybe we'll hear from them again.
Right.
Yeah.
What was the reasoning for repealing the numeric standards?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? You know, I've not been privy to all the backroom conversations. I will say, you know, Vicky's point notwithstanding, I will say that just observing who has argued for and who has argued against this, it seems like industry and municipalities in general, maybe not Missoula, have in general argued for this shift to narrative standards. I wonder if they might regret that when they come to be responsible for documenting the health of the aquatic system downstream, which is not cheap and not easy. When the whole thing maybe gets tied up in, you know, endless confusing litigation because all of a sudden we're not clear who's responsible for what effects. And also fundamentally, if we're serious about protecting the health of our aquatic systems, I mean, if I'm wrong and narrative standards can work, and I've been known to be wrong, then then that's fine, but it doesn't mean we can magically release more nutrients without causing a problem, right? It just means we have a different way of coming to the amount of nutrients that we can release. So it does seem like the sort of polluters group has supported this. I'm not sure they thought it all the way through.
Is this coming from EPA then, or you're saying they're having to implement it, so who's telling them that this needs to happen? And also, is there public commenting available in response to this?
So the legislature passed this. They, in House Bill 664 most recently, they've passed it a few times. They directed Montana DEQ just to straight up repeal our scientifically based numeric standards and replace them with this and only this. Every time DEQ issues a point source discharge permit, essentially a permit to discharge pollution to surface water, there's a public comment period. That's a great opportunity to engage. There's a few of those coming up that we probably will highlight. Many of them are small, but some of them could be quite significant. The EPA has not played a large role. They've stated that in principle, they can accept narrative standards. But again, because we haven't seen the details of how that's going to be implemented, it's hard to put a lot of weight in the EPA's approval there. So yeah, DEQ did not make the decision, but they're the agency charged with implementing this. And I anticipate we will be making some noise as they are issuing discharge permits in the near future. Yeah.
Will reporting agencies still have the ability to kind of go above and beyond and use numeric standards if they desire? Or will DEQ only accept narrative standards now? Or
Yeah.
is that just like totally not?
That's a great question. Well, and yeah, your question kind of cuts to one of the challenges of this, which is that even in narrative standards, there are numbers in there somewhere, right? If you get a permit under narrative standards, it still says, you're allowed to release this many pounds of nitrogen per day. That's a number. And the response variables are measured with numbers. So yeah, at some level, the decision is made qualitatively, but the implementation is still quantitative. So if you're familiar with like total maximum daily loads, which are sometimes applied to smaller streams or watersheds, those still exist. The decision about where we need a total maximum daily load regulation and what it should be, that will be made from a narrative perspective, but that regulation tool still exists and is still numeric. So that's not a complete answer to your question, but it's the closest I've got. You raise your hand.
Yeah, the numeric standards for the Clark Fork River remaining in place, how did that,
They are separate.
is it because of Superfund stuff?
No, it's not because of Superfund. It is because the Clark Fork is naturally high in phosphorus because of the geology of the watershed. And because of that, the Clark Fork experiences this whole algal bloom and ecological degradation dynamic a little more strongly than many other large rivers in the state. And so the Clark Fork has a sort of a history. So essentially the Clark Fork has been ahead of the rest of the state. The main stem Clark Fork has been ahead of the rest of the state. So the numeric standards that apply to the Clark Fork were implemented ahead of and separately from the the numeric standards that applied to the rest of the state. And fortunately, they were not repealed by 664. What that means going forward in terms of now a watershed with narrative standards on the tributaries and numeric standards on the main stem, it's a good question.
Yeah.
You mentioned that the Clark Fork is naturally higher in phosphorus, and I'm wondering whether there's any argument that the narrative approach could actually be more responsive to cases like that, where going by purely a numeric approach, you might end up with much higher nutrient levels in a river that's starting out with high nutrient levels. Is there any case to be made in that direction? I'm with you, but I'm just curious.
Yeah, no, there absolutely could be. And I do think there is some value in recognizing the diversity of our water bodies and how they all respond differently. So at a small scale, I think that's a good point. I would also say this, the standards for the Clark Fork, they don't say how much phosphorus you can put in, they just say what the total allowable concentration of phosphorus in the river is. And so if it's naturally high, then essentially that means we can't add that much more before we hit that trigger. Go ahead, Vicki. And then maybe
I always want to question whether phosphorus is naturally high in the Clark Fork, because that's like saying the copper is naturally high. We mined copper and we threw the waste right beside the river. We mined phosphorus and we threw the waste right beside the river. So I'm not sure that it's naturally high. It's high in phosphorus, yes, but some of that is probably some old phosphate mines we ought to clean up. And the other thing I wanted to say, I've forgotten. It'll come back.
We'll have more Q&A.
all right, we'll hear from you and then we'll move.
Numbers, like you run the numbers higher based on the additional nutrients for a section of river, say on the Clark Fork versus Rock Creek, where you have a little bit less nutrient. So like your averages are a little bit higher in the values from the lowest and highest values.
Are you asking about like
The median, like, so what do you do for abnormal seasons where say it may be warmer and you have an algae explosion, or say the opposite?
Yeah, that's a great question. So these standards, for better or worse, these standards only apply during the growing season. That is, of course, when we see these algal blooms, it's when we see conditions like this. Does that mean nutrients completely don't matter the rest of the year? I'm not comfortable with that statement, right? They're still in the system, they're still getting into lakes downstream and causing issues downstream. If we had unlimited resources under a narrative approach, I think we could actually essentially build off your question and take that pretty far to really try to understand far and wide what the effects of a nutrient source might be and when they occur, even if they occur 50 miles downstream and 7 months later. Putting that all together, I recognize that a numeric framework isn't perfect for dealing with that, but putting it all together under a narrative framework is potentially even more of a challenge.
I was just thinking, like with the weather, I've seen it snow on the 4th of July here in Montana, so the climate changes considerably. Like there are summers where you'll see algae bloom and flatheads, like we've never seen before. In other years, it's too cold for almost any growth.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. And part of the reason, we saw a major algal bloom on the Clark Fork, which is over there. It wasn't because there were more nutrients in the river. It's because there was less water in the river and because it's hotter. So yeah, regulating it just from the numbers, it's limited. Yeah, it's definitely not perfect. We better move on. We'll have more time for discussion at the end. Let's see who's up next.
Let's give Sam a round of applause.
Thanks, Sam. Again, my name is Andrew Gorder, I'm Legal Policy Director. I'm going to shift gears here as we move forward and talk to you guys about some updates on exempt wells. And I shouldn't need this because I just have one slide. So what is an exempt well? Raise your hand if you know what an exempt well is. We talk about it a lot at the Clark Fork Commission. Great. So since 1973, with the passage of the Water Use Act in Montana, if you want to use water, you need to get a permit. The reason for that is we have pre-existing water rights. We have old water rights that need to be protected. They're actually protected by the provisions of our Constitution. So if you want to use water, we don't have enough of it. You need to get a permit and you need to show that your new water use that you want to take out of the ground or out of the river or a stream is not going to adversely affect any pre-existing water rights. And so that permit process can be quite tough depending on where you are. We have basins in Montana that have been statutorily closed to new water rights by the legislature because we're over appropriated. We have more rights to water than we do physical water in some areas. So we have this permit process that's meant to protect existing water rights. It provides due process and notice to existing water users of people who want to come on and use water. That's critical to how we manage and distribute our finite water supplies in the state of Montana. An exempt well is exempt from the permitting process. So that means there's no notice. There is no analysis done by the state to determine whether that new groundwater use it applies only to groundwater, but there's no analysis done to see whether that new groundwater use is going to adversely affect our water resources or any existing water rights. It was really designed as a way for people in sort of rural dispersed areas to get a right to use a small amount of groundwater without going through this pretty onerous permitting process. But as we fast forwarded over time in Montana, that exemption has exploded to really the primary way for us to secure water for new development, for new growth in our state. And over time, that kind of small loophole has grown and grown and grown and grown. It's been a big issue for the Clark Fork Coalition because protection of groundwater is a critical part of our mission, right? As a matter of both fact and law in Montana, we know that groundwater and surface water supplies are connected. And our water resources are at risk. We have over 900 miles of chronically dewatered streams. Just in the Clark Fork Basin alone, the Clark Fork Coalition since 2010 has taken upon ourselves and as part of our mission to purchase water rights, senior water rights, and use those to restore stream flows on chronically dewatered streams so that we don't suffer the severe impacts or as severe impacts from dewatering. We own 27 water rights now in the Clark Fork Basin. We lease another 10 water rights, and some of those water rights date all the way back to 1866 in terms of their priority. So those are very, very important to us. But in the meantime, we've seen this over-reliance on exempt groundwater wells sort of slowly creep more and more into and adversely affect existing senior water rights, including some of our own at the Clark Fork Coalition. And so I want to give an example to really illustrate what this looks like. If we could have Zoe pull up this tool, it'll just take a second. But this was a sort of just a way that our monitoring and data program manager put together to really illustrate the impact or the number of exempt wells in just one area of the basin. So this is the Bitterroot. This is really like the poster child for why we need to do something about exempt groundwater use. The Ravalli County, the Bitterroot Aquifer has been statutorily closed to new water rights, new water uses since 1991. That means if you want to get a new permit, you need to mitigate your new use. So you need to buy an existing water right. This is most often how it's done. You buy a water right and you retire that existing water use so you can have a new water use for a development, for example. But if you're using exempt wells and you're developing outside of a municipal boundary, you don't need that. You can get an exempt well or any number of exempt wells. So as we scroll through time here, I'll have you start moving that so you can see the number of wells start to grow. This is just beginning in 1973 and moving forward in time. And you can see that the number of wells surrounding Hamilton and the rest of the valley just really start to grow. Each of these red dots represents an individual exempt well. Between 2000 and 2021, when we start to see growth and development really explode, especially in western Montana, the population of Ravalli County grew by almost 10,000 people, only 1,700 of which actually settled in a city or a town. So 84% of that new population in the Bitterroot Valley settled in unincorporated areas, meaning they're relying on these exempt wells, they're relying on individual septic systems. So 84% of the 6,000 new homes in Ravalli County that went in that 20-year period were built in unincorporated areas of the county. The total number of wells there, that we have, around 15,000. That's an estimate because that's just exempt wells for which we have a record of. The Montana Bureau of Mines and Geology, their data indicates there's about 24,000 wells in all of Ravalli County. Only 288 wells have a permit. So every other well there, about 24,000 are exempt. This is a problem. And if you scale out a little bit there, you can just see the number, and that includes Missoula County on there, which is, in itself a problem. So if you want to go back to the slide, exempt wells are an issue we've been working on for a long time. This is an example of really where all of our advocacy, years of work on the policy side of exempt wells, in multiple legislative sessions, dating back as far as my time working at the Clark Fork Coalition, all of those efforts have failed to result in meaningful change to the exempt well provisions. In fact, we've seen multiple efforts to make the loophole worse instead of better. So after decades of sort of rampant unmanaged groundwater development, largely most of that occurring in closed basins, the Clark Fork Coalition and a number of other plaintiffs representing senior water users, conservation groups, the League of Cities and Towns representing every single municipality in the state of Montana, joined together. We filed litigation to try to close the exempt well loophole. And we did so on the basis that the statute itself is unconstitutional. So we filed that litigation in November. It's really sort of in the beginning infancy stages of the litigation. So we have a lot of work ahead of us. But really what we're arguing is that the statute itself is not constitutionally compliant because it ignores our constitutional protections for senior water rights, which are enshrined in Article 2, Section 3 and Article 9, Section 3. It violates equal protection and due process. Water rights are property rights. If an action is taken that can affect your property rights, you're entitled to due process of law. That means you get notice, get the opportunity to object before, not after your property rights are impacted. And then we also brought claims under Article 9, Section 3, the Clean and Healthful Environment Clause. So we're arguing that our Constitution says that the legislature must take adequate remedies to prevent the unmitigated depletion of our natural resources. That, I think, to me means at a minimum, we need to know how much groundwater we're giving away. We don't know the answer to that question. We have no ability to regulate, monitor, or otherwise manage these exempt wells, and the number continues to grow year after year, decade after decade. We have over 200,000 statewide. So those are kind of the broad description of the claims that we brought. The plaintiffs, as I mentioned, include individual water users, the Montana Farm Bureau Federation, representing agricultural users, an association from Gallatin County, representing their agricultural water users. Gallatin County is getting absolutely hammered by growth and development right now. And those guys are seeing the impacts on their farms and ranches. Montana Environmental Information Center. Those are the groups that have joined together with us on this. We're pretty excited about the prospects, although again, we're very early on in the state's litigation. But a couple of headlines I threw in there about the case, and just happy to answer what questions I can about exempt wells in general, or the litigation if I can. Yeah, go ahead.
So there still has to be somebody that's making a decision on whether a well is exempt. You still have to go somewhere to get a permit. Just
No.
drill a hole.
Yeah, so the way it works, although there's a new statute that just passed this last legislative session that slightly tweaks the process, but traditionally the way it worked is you drill the well, and then after the fact you go into the DNRC, you file a form that simply says that you drilled your well, and they give you a piece of paper to recognize the fact that you drilled a well. Now, with the passage of, I think it was House Bill 681, the last session, there is you go in before you drill the well and provide notice that you intend to drill an exempt well. That process is just now starting. It doesn't change, the DNRC still cannot deny you as long as you're within the total volume limits of an exempt well, which is 10 acre. But at least is happens before as opposed to after. Go ahead.
Yeah, how much more drilling can be handled before it turns into a happy junction down in Arizona where you have to truck in walk?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there are areas of Montana right now where you can't drill a well. And if you want to develop, you need to rely on a cistern. You got to bring in your own water. That's not the rule, I would say it's the exception, but that's the concern. I don't think that we're there yet. I think we have some pretty robust aquifers in our state. Missoula County is a fairly robust aquifer. But the point is, I think we want to be ahead of this, right? We need to be proactive, and really the law demands that we do. Existing water users, their water rights are protected by the Constitution, by the law. And if you continue to poke holes in the ground all around a farmer's field, at a certain point in time, their rights are going to be meaningless. They're unenforceable. So that's really what we're trying to prevent. Yes.
Are you saying there is no charge for getting an exempt well? You just gotta apply for a permit?
You don't apply for a permit, you file a piece of paper, but there is no, I mean, there's a filing fee associated with which I think is, I don't know if Amy might remember, I think it's like $30 or something.
No, so under I don't work for DNRC, but it's $650 now to go through that predetermination process, and that's for the combined appropriations issue to make sure that they don't have any other developments. But it's, yeah, I think it's $650 now, and back when I worked there 5 years ago, it was $125.
Okay,
I think.
thank you. Yeah, thank you.
So it's gone up quite a bit under this next legislation.
And obviously you have to pay to drill the well, which is not cheap, but there's no.
Well, that's a pretty good deal. I mean, really,
yeah.
I can believe that.
I'd agree. Vicky?
Do communities that have declared a sole source aquifer and set up a water quality district and all that sort of stuff, do they have any say about well drilling to protect the aquifer? Because some contamination goes down a poorly designed well. So sole source aquifer, they can't protect it. So it doesn't give the local community any say so about drilling.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't give them a say to limit new exempt wells being drilled into the same aquifer.
One more question, Andrew?
Yeah.
What would happen to the unregulated wells if you did win this case? Would they have to then go get permitted?
So the claims that we brought and the relief that we requested does not include getting rid of existing exempt wells. What we've asked is for the court to enjoin the existing statute, which would mean going forward, it's assuming we win, as of the date of that decision, going forward, the exempt well provision would be struck from the law. So you could not get a water well without getting a permit. I think realistically, what would happen if we were successful is that the legislature would go back to the drawing board and try to tweak and amend the law to really grapple with this issue. So I don't think it's realistic to say that we won't have any form of exempt wells if we're successful with this litigation. It's just a matter of whether that mechanism is going to be constitutionally compliant.
What do you think the chances of seeing exempt wells and nutrient standards in the next legislative session are?
100%.
100%. Those are long-term issues we have been focusing and advocating, and Watchdogs have been advocating on in that legislative process. The next two things we have for you are more under the theme of emerging threats or existing threats that we need to see movement on. And I think you're up next, Brian.
Awesome. Why don't we take, we've been at it for an hour now. Thank you. I'm so proud of you all for being here. It's really exciting to see this full room. Thank you for being here. Let's take 30 seconds to stretch. I know you need it. Come on, 30 seconds. Grab a drink if you need one. 30 seconds.
Okay, let's settle back here. Let's settle back here.
Figured everybody could go get a drink really quick. Hey, my name is Brian Chapman. I'm the executive director over at the Clark Fork Coalition. And I'm so grateful that you all came out to hear about some of the things that we think about on a daily basis and that we've been watchdogging for sometimes decades. Just we have the opportunity to share that with you and bring you up to speed on kind of where we are. What I have been charged with talking about, which I'm very excited to talk about, is the Smurfit-Stone container site just west of Missoula along the banks and the floodplain of the Clark Fork River near Frenchtown, Montana. Now, there are people in the room that are far more intimate with the Smurfit site than I am, but I'm charged with talking about it tonight because it is something that we hear about all the time, even in the comments that were made when you registered. If some of you registered for this, like, what do you want to hear about? It's like, Smurfit, why is it taking so long? Why can't you clean it up? Why can't you do anything about it? What's going on at Smurfit? And so tonight, I just want to give a pretty broad overview of both what the issue is, what is the site, what is this all about, and then what our approach to it is and what you might be able to expect in the coming years. So Smurfit-Stone container site was a pulp mill that started operations in 1957 and closed in 2010, like December 31st, 2009. We closed it roughly, 2010 for all intents and purposes. And over its 54-year lifespan, it was a pulp mill. It also grew to a size and a footprint of about 3,400 acres. That included roughly about 140-acre unlined waste dump, about 900 sporadically spread acres of wastewater ponds, separated from the Clark Fork River by a 4-mile berm. And as you know, or you may not know about pulp and paper mills, that they create a good amount of waste, and a good amount of toxic waste that has a variety of different chemicals and pollutants in it. Water watchdogging the Smurfit-Stone site was actually part of the genesis story of the Clark Fork Coalition. In the mid-1980s, a coalition of interested citizens, environmental groups in and around the area got together to try to force to force the state of Montana to enforce the Clean Water Act by permitting or not permitting the discharge of pollutants from the Smurfit-Stone site into the Clark Fork River. And we were successful in not permitting the discharge of pollutants into the river all year round, and actually putting pretty big limits on that point source at Smurfit. The mill closed, as I said, in 2010. It was fairly sudden. It abandoned many jobs in Frenchtown. It was a big hit to the local economy. It shuttered the site and it left a substantial amount of contamination on the floodplain and in and around the mill site. The United States Environmental Protection Agency started investigating the site for consideration as a Superfund site and potential listing on the National Priorities List, which is the list of Superfund sites under CERCLA. Everybody know what CERCLA is? Want to repeat after me? Comprehensive Environmental Response. Anybody know the C? Compensation Liability Act. And now you know where the EPA is sitting. And under the Superfund Act or CERCLA, the act was designed to assess and address risks to human health from industrial contamination and to hold the polluters or the originators of that contamination retroactively liable for its cleanup. The Smurfit site was proposed for listing on the NPL in 2013, although it was never officially listed as a Superfund site. In 2015, the owners, also known as the owners and the former operators, the potentially responsible parties, entered into agreement with the US government through the EPA to agree to clean up the site as if it were a Superfund site. So whether that's an important detail or not, it's an interesting fact. So the administrative order of consent is the agreement in which the potentially responsible parties agree to go through the Superfund process and investigate and remediate the site. So what's going on? Why is it taking so long? So it's 2015, today's 2026. What's going on? Where are we? What does this look like? Let's start with a few facts. There's a few things to get straight about. There's a lot, right? You can Google search Smurfit and you can find master's theses and you can find articles and you can find all kinds of interesting information. You can go to Frenchtown the first Thursday of every month and you can sit with the Smurfit-Stone Community Advisory Group. You can go to the brewery a couple times a year. You can meet with the EPA and talk to the Smurfit. There's so much information out there. Let's get a couple really important facts straight relative to what's going on and what we can do about it, what you can expect moving forward. First fact, Smurfit is a privately owned site. The owners, some of which are potentially responsible parties, are responsible for paying for the stages of the Superfund process, which include site assessment, characterization, which includes sampling and analysis, and the final chosen remedy, not choosing it, but doing the remedy, actually cleaning up the site. The EPA, US EPA, oversees the process. They hold the potentially responsible parties accountable. We usually just use the acronyms, PRPs, but I try to give it all out there. Every time I use an acronym, I get somebody pointing at me like, what is that? What is that acronym? So potentially responsible parties, PRP, forgive me if I say that. And the EPA also importantly selects the final remedy for cleanup. There's a lot of other trustees legally involved in the process. They have a legal stake in the process, the state of Montana, the tribes, the Confederated Salish and Cootie tribes, the United States Forest Service, of being an adjacent and a landowner near and on the site. And these folks are afforded the opportunity to substantively weigh in on site decision-making, although they don't have necessarily the same stake in choosing the final remedy as does the EPA. That's their job. Ultimately, as I said, the EPA will select the final remedy based on managing risk to human health, but they must consider other factors. Public acceptance of that remedy is one of those factors. And that's why weighing in on the Superfund site and on this process at a given time is very important. I hope it goes without saying that Clark Fork Coalition, our role in this whole thing is to advocate for what's best for the river, for the watershed, and for the community as part of that watershed. And so that's kind of what we do. We recognize though that we recognize the process. And I think one of the things that I think about when people ask, why is this taking so long? Where are we? Why haven't we seen more? Is that Superfund is slow. It is a slow process. Now, I don't mean to get anybody off the hook with that statement, right? Neither the EPA nor the potentially responsible parties. But it is a slow process. And if you just a quick look upstream at the Upper Clark Fork operable unit of Superfund will give us a pretty good example. There was a record of decision on that Superfund site in 2004. There's in just the first reach A, There's 22 phases of cleanup. It's a 45-mile reach, and we've completed 7 of them. Right, so it's a slow process. And it's marked by really important places where you can participate as a public. And one of those places is coming up, hopefully quite soon. Let's see, where was I? Let's go to this. Let's look at the Superfund snake for a second. This is the, I'm not sure, but there's so many different Superfund snakes out there, but this is the only one that really looks like a snake. So I put that up there. And it's probably missing some detail and whatnot, but in the end, we're around here. The PRPs with consultation with the EPA has collected a lot of data. And the EPA is about to release, hopefully later this year, this thing called the remedial investigation. The remedial investigation is going to provide all of, and the data is actually out there. The data for the remedial investigation is publicly available, but it's also going to be the analysis of all this data together, what it looks like. What is the site? What does the contamination look like? What could we potentially do about that contamination on where it's placed on the floodplain across the site and things like that? What follows that is this thing called the feasibility study. Feasibility study is how feasible are different remedies for cleaning up the site. What are the different alternatives? There'll be a plan and a chosen remedy. That's where we got this big stop sign here. And that's where we have a really important place to weigh in on the process and say, this is what we will and we won't accept at the site as the public. This is what we're interested in. Now remember, saying that, this is a private property site. The private property owners would like to develop that site. They bought the site so that they could make money off it. That's, we're in the capitalist system. That's an important piece to keep in mind. We, as the public, want to make sure that human health is protected and the environment's protected. Clark Fork Coalition's big stake here is we want to make sure that the river is protected. We want to make sure that that river around the floodplain is protected, that the river can move, that it can operate, and that it protects itself downstream. So that's what, when the time comes, we're going to advocate for. Is there a place that we can come to a middle ground between the development that the developers want to see happen on the site, the necessities of cleaning the site so that there's no risk to human health, and the protection of the floodplain so that the river can act and move as a river does. So that's what we're going to be looking for in this process. We have the publicly available data right now. Our staff scientist, who you heard from about nutrients, you can tell the inner workings of his brain. He's in that data right now, and we are preparing to weigh in substantively in every step of the process around the decisions that are made from that data. In the end, bottom line, an ideal world, Clark Fork Coalition would love to see the dumps and the wastewater ponds completely remediated. We would love to see the berms removed, and we would love to see the floodplain reconnected. We recognize, as I mentioned to you earlier, that there's some constraints around that based on land ownership, based on feasibility, based on the needs and human health. And we're just gonna hopefully negotiate as best we can and bring everybody along with us what we find to weigh in when the time comes. So in short, yes, it's taken a long time. Superfund's long, but we're at a really important inflection point here soon when the remedial investigation is released later this year, when the feasibility study commences. It is becoming time for us to get more involved as a community in Smurfit. And we hope that we can bring the developers out here and we can have a public meeting with them. We can let them know there are concerns. They can tell us their concerns, and we can potentially reach this spot where something viable happens at this site. The community potentially takes a little bit more ownership, whether that be public or not, who knows, of the floodplain area. And that site can be a benefit to the river ecologically in the future. I hope so. So, questions? Beverly.
What's the owner's development vision?
I've seen it a couple times. There's a little bit of housing. There's some potentially some light industry. I've seen a drawing for a golf course on the floodplain. Kind of thrown that out of my head. I don't like that one. That's not for me to decide, but I have seen that drawing. So I think housing. Some light industry. There's some other things swirling around out there. At the end of the day, and I want to be really clear about this, that it will be a business decision for the owner. And if there's a carrot to some part of that, I think cleanup can happen faster. right? I think that they can drive that a little bit faster, say, yeah, we want to put money out there, we want to take the buildings down, we want to start cleaning the site. And so there's a negotiation to happen there about, you know, how much will the public push back on what development, what does this look like? We need housing in Missoula in the community. Is that a place where housing is acceptable? We don't know. That'll all come out in the remedial investigation, the characterization of the site. So great question. I'll go back here and then up here.
How close is a public purchase through bonds or, I don't know, any type of state funds, allocations? How close have you guys gotten to that?
Of the whole site? Yeah, I don't know. That's a great question. I love this question. I love where your head's at. It's expensive. I don't want to misquote how much that site was purchased for.
Oh, quite a bit.
What about just the floodplain part?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I don't want to overspeak there. It's on our mind. How about that? Yeah, great question. It's a great question.
About how like involved is the Forest Service throughout this process? Have you guys been in communication with them and what their opinion is on this?
Yeah, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, there's a patch of federal Forest Service land sort of right smashed between the site and the river, and it's a small patch, but they have been quite, so they are a trustee, I think. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
And they've been quite involved in the process.
I feel like when you hear about Smurfit, there's always this sense of urgency, like environmental catastrophe, firms breaching, whatever. How does that factor into the Superfund? You know, what's the contingency plan? Is there a contingency plan?
It's a great question, Chloe. I have my answer, but maybe I'll look at my staff scientist who is more intimate with the climate projections and the flood data.
Yeah, so there is, in my opinion, great risk of a flood that would cause catastrophic downstream harm, and the Clark Fork Basin had seen that play out before. That being said, you know, the right speed to do Superfund is as fast as you can, but no faster. We don't want the site to be cleaned up before it's fully characterized. We want the community have time to weigh in. The berms have protected the site for the last 50 years. They have kept the river separate, and the EPA does monitor the berms, and they have a contingency plan in place to try to, you know, sort of maintain and support the berms if there is a large flooding event. If we see a flood, the scale of, you know, like the 19-year flood, this basin has had huge floods in the past. I don't know. I don't think any contingency plan. At that point, I think it's just a question of whether the waste is still in the floodplain or not. So yeah, it's a good question. It's yet another reason for urgency, but this stuff takes a long time for a reason.
And with the recent precipitation trajectories around here, and you know, I think our connotation is really easily to go to this idea of like, oh well, it's just too warm down here, it's not going to happen. But the flood of 1908 was a rain on snow event, where it was a late season event that had a cold snap that put a lot of snow in the floodplain, and then it got warm really fast, and it was a rain on snow event. Like, these things are very, very possible. And I've just been given the wrap-up sign. Before I wrap up, I would love to say that we're going to continue this conversation afterwards with a little Q&A. We're also going to continue with some beers afterwards, and there are some Superfund experts we have with us. And I'm sorry for embarrassing you, but we have the site manager for Smurfit with us. We have the community engagement coordinator with us, and we have the state Superfund director with us from EPA. So you definitely informally introduce yourself to those folks and say hi, and I know they love that as well. So I hope that's okay that I introduce.
Oh, thank you.
I can't take it back now.
We're here.
Yeah.
Learning.
So anyway, we'll move on to the next one, and thank you very much for your time.
Okay, I'm gonna wrap up and try to move fairly quickly here, but wanted to give everyone an update about the Sheep Creek mine proposal on the West Fork, the Bitterroot. I know that is front of mind for a lot of people in the community, a lot of people who either live in the Bitterroot, members of ours. or recreate in the Bitterroot, just enjoy the outstanding water resources of that important tributary of the Clark Fork River. But I wanted to start for getting into the mine and developments, I guess, recent developments, by talking about something that I literally know next to nothing about, which is rare earth elements. So I'm not an expert, I just want to put it out there. If there are questions that people have, I'm going to direct them probably elsewhere. Or maybe someone in the audience knows more about this than I do, but I do know that we need rare earth elements, right? They're critically important for sort of new technology, green technology, things like electric vehicles, our cell phones. And I also know that rare earth elements are not actually that rare. They're commonly found in the Earth's crust, but they're often in small quantities and they're difficult to extract. And also we know that mining for rare earth elements can be incredibly destructive. One study that I read from the Harvard Environmental Review found that for every ton of rare earths mined, 2,000 tons of toxic waste are produced. China is really the leader in rare earth element mining currently, and obviously the United States is trying to step up our game and become more self-reliant on our own supplies for these important elements. But the question is whether we should boost our own supplies to help provide for this modern technology by building new mines, or recovering these existing elements from recycled materials, or from the kind of like vast array of mine waste piles that we have littered across, particularly in the American West. So that kind of brings some context to the Sheep Creek proposal itself and the project. The Sheep Creek itself is the headwaters, one of the headwaters of the West Fork of the Bitterroot River. It flows sort of in a northeastern direction here to the West Fork, down into Painted Rock reservoirs. It's about, I don't know, 30 miles from Darby. That's an estimate. But the rumors kind of have been swirling about this Sheep Creek mine proposal since kind of the spring of 2023, when this company known as US Critical Materials announced its plan to develop its claims, its deposits, which contain, according to the company, at least 13 critical risk materials. Those critical risk REEs are defined on a list that was put out by the Trump administration. And that announcement was met with a pretty immediate outcry from the community. A lot of folks who are really concerned, as the Bitterroot's not only just a cherished, outstanding water resource, an important tributary of the Clark Fork River, but a huge economic driver, right, for the whole Bitterroot Valley, providing water for municipal use, providing water for irrigation, for recreation, for the fishery. But throughout that process, the company just kind of kept its head down. It was really difficult for us or anyone else to get any information about what their actual plans were. And they kind of sailed through, the summer of 2024 and the summer of 2025, requesting these permission from the Forest Service to do limited hand tool exploration, kind of feel out, gather more information about their claims down there. And then cut to November of 2025, and there's this sudden announcement that the project has been added to the Fast 41 permitting list for the Trump administration, which I won't get into what Fast 41 is and is not, but it was certainly alarming for a lot of people who hadn't heard really any details about what this proposal was, and all of a sudden it's being fast-tracked, right? So there's an immediate public meeting held by the River Valley County Commissioners in December. I was at that meeting. It was at the fairgrounds. Was anybody else at that meeting? Yeah, number of folks. It was a packed house. There was like 600-700 people there. Not one person in the room seemed to be in favor of this project, and the River Valley County Commissioners really put the company's representatives on the spot, and said, you know, what are your plans here? Why is this proceeding without any kind of public engagement or really trying to get any buy-in from the community? And so I think the message was pretty loud and clear that folks either flat out did not want this project or they want things to slow down. And the Ravalli County Commissioners, to their credit, did send a letter to our congressional representatives saying they don't want this project on the Fast 41 list. And we heard some good things kind of from a couple of our representatives following that meeting. And then after that, it kind of seemed to backtrack, and they said, oh, well, this seems like a good project, but we want to do it right, you know. So all of that happened pretty quickly, and it just seemed like the company here was more interested in drumming up kind of political and potentially investor support for their project, as opposed to actually engaging with the community about what their intentions were. Following that, the company did submit its first draft plan of operations to the Bitterroot National Forest. That was really the first document that we had seen that gave us something to look at and analyze what their plans were, what the scope of that, what the timeline was, and that would sort of kickstart a potential permitting process, which is where we at the Clark Fork Coalition typically engage both at our staff and alerting the public and our members, hey, here's your opportunity to look at this, comment. But the draft plan of operations, when we actually looked at it, there really wasn't anything there. It was almost like a pamphlet that they had prepared for investors, no details about any of the potential impacts. This is their first opportunity to get ahead of an environmental impact statement or an environmental assessment from the Forest Service and say, here's what we're going to do, here's how we're not going to significantly impact the environment. There was really nothing there. They talked about the equipment that they wanted to use to drill, and they talked about some kind of idea for a closed loop water system where they wouldn't be using or consuming any water or discharging any water. It didn't really make sense. So what we did is we looked at that document and we submitted our own comment letter to the Forest Service that outlined, just from a water resource perspective, all of the shortcomings of this draft plan of operations. And the list is quite long. I mean, there just wasn't anything that the Forest Service could look at and make an informed decision about the environmental impacts based on the information that, or the lack of information that had been provided. So not much there. I have copies of our letter that we sent to the Forest Service. If anybody would like to take a look at that, feel free to grab me afterwards and I'll pass that along. But a number of other groups did the same thing. I know Trout Unlimited submitted some pretty significant comments, American Rivers, a number of individuals and other groups in the Bitterroot Water Partnership has been tracking this very closely. So we're definitely not the only ones engaging. There's a large coalition of folks really who want to learn more and fully engage in this project, but it's been kind of it's been difficult so far given the lack of transparency from the mining company itself. The latest news on the Sheep Creek is that the company is currently working on revising its draft plan of operations, and what we've heard from I think reputable sources is that they're actually scaling back what they want to do. They want to scale down and say, oh, we just want to do some more initial exploration here before we get into any actual plans that would involve significant drilling, any kind of permitting for water discharge or water use or mining activity itself. So all that to say, I think that we're quite a ways out from seeing anything tangible on the Sheep Creek project, but we want to keep a very close eye on it, given the significant concerns that we have just about water resources. You know, I listed a few here at the bottom of the slide, but we don't know enough to say what those impacts are, but they could be pretty significant. We're talking about critical habitat for bull trout. We're talking about, mining activity that could result in a significant amount of water use and wastewater. We're talking about waste rock piles piled next to important tributaries. Their plan, at least so far, is to have off-site processing of any materials that they, or elements that they mine, which is sort of a good thing. But if you consider where the project is at and the road infrastructure that they need to transport all of this material along, the Sheep Creek itself, the West Fork of the Bitterroot, these are extremely important, sensitive waterways. We do not want 50 truckloads a day of highly contaminated materials or sensitive materials being transported along that infrastructure. So there's a whole bunch of issues here to be sorted out, but we just are kind of waiting for something to sink our teeth into before we fully engage. That's what we know, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
So is that draft plan of operations available? Like, can I contact Forest Service and?
It's on the Forest Service website. Yep. If you go to the West Fork District and their project page, you can find it under the project.
And one other thing that really was a concern for me when I went to that meeting, the US Critical Minerals made a big deal, like you said, of the self-contained water operation. But the first thing I read in public documents after that was, well, if we need water, we're gonna get it out of Sheep Creek or the West Fork. So we made this big point of saying, we're gonna keep everything contained and safe, and then boom, we're gonna take water from our surface, nearby surface resources.
Right.
And that just really rubbed me the wrong way.
Yeah, definitely kind of hearing two different things when you see the little public engagement that they've done versus what they are talking about on paper. Doesn't build a lot of trust for sure.
So this is plan of operations for just exploration. They backed off and saying, we're just talking exploration, people. This is not a plan of operations for a full-blown mine.
Correct. Yep. Although, when we comment on any plan of operations for exploration, we want to be thinking ahead to full mine development. So we will comment as if that's the plan. But yes, right now they're just talking about exploration.
What do their other sites look like? Does that maybe a good road they want to put in? Yeah,
that's a good question. So the really interesting thing about this company is that they've never mined before. We don't have anything to compare it to because they have no track record in the mining business. This is just speculation, but it seems to me that they are looking to offload this project pretty quickly. They're trying to drum up the investment, draw a lot of interest, get the buy-in of the federal government, and then sell it to a company that actually knows how to mine.
Andrew, I'm gonna pause you just because can I see the little clicker? We are at 7:30, so again, you guys, thank you, wrong way. Thank you so much for coming out. We still wanna hear some more questions. We still wanna have some more discussion with you, but if you do need to take off and you are not already a member of our Water Watchdog group, it is a specific segment of our membership and of our mailing list. And it is where you want to be if you want to be getting notices about, hey, there's a discharge permit that's getting permitted and under the narrative standards, and we need you to weigh in on it. If you want to be getting notifications about, oh, Sheep Creek is moving, Smurfit is moving, this is the sign up that you want to do. And so I'm just going to put that up really quickly for anybody who has to take off and is not already a part of that. We are at 7:30, so thank you for sticking with us. And I know our staff is willing to sit around and do this part of the night with you for some time. And hear more questions specifically about Smurfit or other ideas and other concerns that maybe didn't get highlighted as a CFC focus tonight. So I'll turn it back to answering questions to our team up here. But thank you again for coming out and being part of our community tonight.